When I was a child, school didn't quite feel like the right place for me. It wasn't that I didn't want to learn. In fact, I loved learning more than anything. But while the other children were busy copying answers from the blackboard, my mind would drift into spaces far beyond the classroom walls. I'd stare at the light coming through the window and ask myself strange questions no one else around me seemed to be asking. What is light made of? Does time always move at the same speed? Why does gravity pull us down and not up? I didn't have the vocabulary or the formulas to explain what I was thinking, but the questions never stopped coming. Teachers often misunderstood me. I was slow to speak as a young boy, and sometimes they thought I was quiet because I didn't understand the lessons, but that wasn't it. I just preferred to think before I spoke. I liked to observe first. I listened more than I talked, not because I was shy, but because I was thinking deeply about things that others overlooked. My classmates could memorize facts quickly, but I wanted to know why those facts were true in the first place. You see, the world around me never seemed as simple as it was presented in textbooks. Everyone accepted certain rules without question, but I couldn't. If someone told me the sky was blue because that's just how it is, I wouldn't be satisfied. I wanted to know what was happening in the air, in the light, in the molecules that made it appear that way. And if someone told me a rule in math or physics, I needed to see the logic behind it, to feel how it worked, not just remember it by heart. That kind of thinking didn't earn me praise at the time. In fact, some people thought I was a little odd. But I never stopped questioning. I never stopped imagining, and that imagination more than anything became my most powerful tool. There was one moment I remember vividly. I imagined what it would be like to ride on a beam of light. Just imagine holding on to a ray of sunlight and flying through space with it. What would I see? Would time slow down or stop completely? Would the light wave look still if I moved at its speed? These weren't things I read in books, they were daydreams, ideas that came to me when I let my thoughts wander. And over time, those daydreams turned into serious ideas. I began to understand that there were hidden patterns in nature, invisible truths waiting to be discovered. The very things I was once scolded for my curiosity, my endless questions became the driving force behind everything I would go on to do. Looking back, I don't blame the teachers or the system. Not everyone can see what's going on inside a child's head, especially when that child doesn't speak up much. But I do wish more people understood that not every mind works the same way. Sometimes a child who seems distracted or quiet is actually thinking about the universe in a way no one else has thought of before. I learned to be patient with myself, to trust my questions even if they didn't have answers right away. I read books slowly, not because I couldn't read fast, but because I wanted to feel each idea. I worked through problems in my head, rolling them around like puzzles. I didn't memorize, I visualized. I didn't repeat, I reasoned. And once I started to see that my way of thinking had value, I never stopped believing in it. So if you're someone who doesn't fit perfectly into the system, someone who sees the world a little differently, hold on to that. Let your questions guide you. Let your imagination take the lead. Because the way your mind works may not just be different, it may be the very thing that changes how the rest of the world understands everything. And that, I believe, is a gift worth trusting. People often say that knowledge is everything, that the more you know, the farther you'll go. But I've always felt that knowledge, while incredibly important, has its limits. Knowledge is like a map of what we already understand. It shows us where we've been, what's been proven, what the rules are. But imagination now, that's something else entirely. Imagination isn't limited by what's already known. It lets us travel beyond the map into territories no one has explored yet. It lets us ask what if and why not, and it's in those questions that real breakthroughs are born. There were many times when I would sit quietly, lost in thought, and someone would ask me what I was doing. When I told them I was imagining a clock in space, or picturing someone falling from a rooftop in a world without gravity, they would laugh or look confused. But those little scenes, those mental experiments, became the foundation of ideas that would later help explain how time and space are connected. I never needed a laboratory full of machines. My laboratory was in my mind. I'd picture a train moving close to the speed of light, and I'd ask myself how the people on that train would see time passing compared to those standing still on the ground. And then I'd imagine how light would behave in that situation, and whether it would reach them at the same speed or change. No book could answer those questions for me. They hadn't been asked in that way yet. It was imagination that allowed me to stretch beyond the facts, to challenge the rules everyone else followed. There were many people around me, brilliant minds, experienced scientists who stuck to what could be calculated and measured. And that's important, of course. We need precision, evidence, structure. But if we never imagine anything beyond what we already know, then we're stuck. We're only repeating what's already been said. I was told more than once that my ideas were foolish, that certain things I believed couldn't be true. That time was constant, that space was fixed, that light would never behave the way I suggested. But I didn't let that stop me. Not because I thought I was smarter than anyone else, but because I trusted what I saw in my imagination. I followed those images in my head like clues. I let them guide me to equations that matched what I'd already felt to be true deep inside. And when I finally shared some of those ideas, they were not always accepted right away. Change never is. People are more comfortable with what they already understand. But over time, as the math was tested and as the predictions matched real-world results, those impossible ideas started to become part of the foundation of modern science. It's strange to think how much of that came not from textbooks, but from simple moments of wonder staring at light, asking how gravity would act near a star, picturing the universe as a giant web where time bends and stretches. That's what imagination does. It connects things others don't think to connect. It sees the invisible. I truly believe that children understand this better than anyone. Watch a child play, and you'll see imagination in its purest form. They turn a stick into a sword, a box into a spaceship. They don't need anyone to tell them what's possible. They create it. Somewhere along the way, as we grow older, we're told to stop doing that, to focus only on what's real, what's measurable. But I never let go of that childlike wonder. I never stopped imagining, and maybe that's why, even in the most complicated parts of science, I always found beauty not just in the answers, but in the questions themselves. Imagination, to me, is not a distraction from science. It's the spark that makes science possible. It's what takes us from what is to what could be. So when I tell you that imagination is more powerful than knowledge, I don't mean that knowledge isn't valuable. It absolutely is. But knowledge tells us what we already know. Imagination is what helps us discover what we haven't yet understood. And in that gap between knowing and dreaming is where all the great mysteries of the universe are waiting. At one point in my life, I found myself working at a patent office, not exactly the kind of place you'd expect changing ideas to come from. It wasn't a grand university or a high-tech lab. It was a modest room filled with stacks of papers, technical drawings, and inventions waiting to be reviewed. My job was simple: examine the details of devices other people had designed and decide whether their ideas were new, useful, and worthy of protection. Day after day, I sat at that desk, reading about machines, engines, clocks, all kinds of devices. Some were clever, others confusing, but each one gave me a glimpse into the minds of people trying to solve problems. At first, it seemed like routine work, but the more I read, the more I started to notice patterns. I wasn't just reviewing inventions, I was studying how people thought. I began to imagine how one idea might connect with another, how one principle could apply to something totally different. And because the job didn't demand all of my mental energy, I had time to think, to really think. I could sit with an idea, roll it around in my mind, and stretch it in every direction. It was there, in that quiet little office, surrounded by blueprints and applications, that my imagination had space to roam freely. I started performing thought experiments while I worked, not with lab equipment, but in my head. I'd imagine someone falling from a roof and ask, what would they feel during the fall? Would they experience gravity? Or would they feel weightless? I'd picture light traveling through space and wonder how it looked to someone moving alongside it. These weren't just passing thoughts, they became entire worlds inside my mind. There was something beautiful about the simplicity of the setting. No pressure, no lectures, no academic expectations. Just me, a desk, and time. And sometimes that's all a person needs. The truth is, you don't need a fancy environment to have extraordinary ideas. You don't need expensive tools or recognition to begin exploring something new. What matters most is your willingness to question, to imagine, and to follow your curiosity wherever it leads. Most people might look at a patent office as a place where creativity ends, where inventions are already finished and need to be filed away. But for me, it became a beginning. It became the place where I realized that the rules we follow in science, the assumptions we make about space, time, and motion, they might not be as fixed as we think. They might be waiting to be re-examined through a different lens. I remember one particular moment when I was reading a file about synchronized clocks and the problems engineers faced when trying to coordinate time across long distances. That sparked something in me. I began to wonder, what does it mean for two events to happen at the same time if you're moving quickly from one to the other? Does simultaneity mean the same thing for everyone? That one question eventually led to a chain of thoughts that turned into an entirely new way of understanding time itself. No one at the office knew what was going on inside my head. To them, I was just a quiet man doing his job, reviewing patents and stamping papers. But inside, my imagination was catching fire. I had no titles, no formal academic position, and yet in that silence I found clarity. I found the courage to challenge old beliefs, not out of arrogance, but out of deep curiosity. It's easy to think that only special people in special places make important discoveries, but I believe that some of the most powerful ideas are born in the most ordinary settings, during a walk, in the shower, sitting quietly at a desk while the rest of the world moves around you. Great ideas don't need permission. They only need attention, persistence, and the freedom to grow. So if you ever feel like your environment is too plain, too small, too removed from where you think real success happens, think again. What you need most is already with you: your mind, your questions, and your ability to imagine something no one else sees yet. That's where the extraordinary begins. When I first began exploring the strange behaviors of time, space, and energy, I wasn't trying to make life more convenient or practical. I was simply trying to understand how the universe really works. But over time, I realized something beautiful: the theories I was developing, these strange and often abstract ideas, weren't just mathematical puzzles. They were deeply connected to the world people live in every day. What began as thought experiments and questions about light, clocks, and gravity slowly grew into ideas that would eventually shape everything from the way we use technology to how we see the universe itself. Take time, for example. For most people, time feels fixed, constant like a river flowing steadily in one direction. That's what I believed too, until I started to look closer. I imagined what would happen if someone traveled near the speed of light. Would time still move the same for them? Would they experience a minute in the same way someone standing still would? The answer, surprisingly, was no. Time actually slows down for objects moving very fast. Not in theory and reality. That idea might sound like science fiction, but today it's something we use in everyday life. Think about the GPS on your phone. The satellites that make GPS work are moving at high speeds above the Earth. If we didn't account for the way time slows down for them, your navigation would be off by kilometers. So when you're following a map on your screen, heading to work or trying to find a cafe, you're relying on the effects of time dilation, an idea that came from a quiet thought about what happens when you chase a beam of light. Then there's space itself. For so long, people thought space was just empty, a blank stage where events happen. But I came to see that space and time aren't separate things at all. They're woven together, like threads in the same fabric. And just like a fabric, space-time can bend and stretch. Massive objects like stars or planets don't just sit in space, they actually curve it. That's why things fall. That's why the planets orbit the sun. They're not being pulled in a straight line, they're following curves in the fabric of space-time itself. This understanding changed the way scientists thought about gravity. It wasn't just a force between two objects. It was a result of how mass shapes the space around it. And once we understood that, we could explain everything from black holes to the way light bends around galaxies. These aren't just facts to be stored in textbooks, they're pieces of a larger puzzle that describe the way everything moves, from tiny atoms to giant stars. Energy was another piece of that puzzle. I realized that mass and energy were not two separate things. They are deeply connected, in fact. They are two sides of the same coin. That simple idea, expressed in a single equation, has had enormous consequences. It helped scientists understand the sun, where massive amounts of energy are released as atoms collide and fuse. It helped explain how stars live and how they die. And yes, it also led to powerful technologies, both for good and for destruction. The fact that such a compact idea that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared could unlock so much about the universe taught me something very important. Even the most abstract scientific truths can eventually become part of our lives. Whether it's through helping a spacecraft navigate, powering the electricity in our cities, or simply understanding the origin of light from distant stars, these discoveries reach far beyond the pages of academic journals. I've always believed that science should never stay locked away in the minds of a few. It should belong to everyone. It should help us see the world more clearly, live more thoughtfully, and dream more bravely. And if my ideas have helped move us even a little closer to that, then I consider that my greatest success. Because in the end, science isn't just about solving equations or building theories. It's about connecting what we know with how we live. There came a time when the questions I asked could no longer stay within the quiet walls of my study. The world was changing not just in terms of science, but in deeper, more troubling ways. War was rising across nations. Hatred was turning into action. People were dividing themselves by borders, by beliefs, by fear. And as someone who had spent a lifetime searching for truth and clarity in the universe, I couldn't just stand by and watch humanity lose its own. I've always believed that knowledge should lead to understanding, not destruction. But during those dark years, knowledge was being used for power, for control, for weapons. Scientific discoveries that once brought light were now being turned into tools of war. It was heartbreaking. The very ideas that were born out of wonder, the exploration of energy, the study of atoms, the unlocking of the unseen forces of nature, were now being twisted into machines that could take life rather than protect it. It would have been easier to stay silent. After all, I wasn't a politician. I wasn't a general, but something inside me wouldn't allow that. If a person understands the power of an idea, then they also carry the responsibility of guiding its use. I could not remain on the sidelines while the knowledge we uncovered was being pointed like a weapon at the world. So I began to speak, not with anger, but with urgency. I spoke for peace, for cooperation, for humanity. I used whatever voice I had, whether it was through letters, interviews, or public statements, to remind people that science should serve life, not destroy it. I knew it wasn't always popular. I knew many disagreed, especially those who believed that strength came from fear. But I also knew something else. Silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of approval, and I would not give it. But it wasn't just war that worried me. It was ignorance. I saw what happened when people were denied education, when they were told not to think for themselves, when curiosity was treated as rebellion. That, to me, was the true danger. Not just bombs or armies, but a world where people stopped asking questions, where minds were closed, where learning was reserved for only a few. That's why I spoke just as passionately for education as I did for peace. I believed every child, no matter where they were born, deserved the chance to learn, not just facts and formulas, but how to think, how to wonder, how to challenge, how to dream. I knew from my own life that true growth doesn't come from memorizing answers. It comes from learning how to ask better questions. I imagined a world where, instead of competing to be the most powerful, nations would compete to be the most kind, the most creative, the most generous with ideas. A world where education wasn't a privilege, but a birthright, where every boy and girl had the tools to build not just a better life for themselves, but a better future for all of us. I knew these were big hopes. Some even called them naive, but I've never seen hope as weakness to me. It's the most courageous thing a person can hold on to, especially when the world seems set on tearing it away. There were times I felt discouraged, times when war marched louder than reason, times when cruelty silenced compassion, but I kept speaking, not because I believed I could stop it all by myself, but because I believed in the ripple of words. One thought can lead to another, one honest voice can inspire many, and sometimes all it takes is a spark to light a much bigger flame. So I kept using the voice I had, not just to share knowledge, but to remind the world how knowledge should be used. To guide, not to dominate, to heal, not to hurt, to lift up, not to crush, because in the end, it's not what we know that defines us. It's what we choose to do with what we know. That's where true greatness lies. Fame, when it came, never felt quite real to me. People would stop me on the street, ask for photographs, write long letters from places I'd never been. They called me a genius, a miracle mind, someone who had unlocked the universe. But I never saw myself that way. To me, I was still the same curious soul who once stared at the stars, puzzled over a compass as a boy, and asked the kinds of questions that had no easy answers. The spotlight never changed that. In fact, the more people admired me, the more I felt the need to remind myself how small I really was, not out of false modesty, but out of genuine perspective, compared to the vastness of the cosmos, to the mysteries we have yet to even touch. No human being is truly great. We are all just travelers trying to understand the journey. That's how I always saw it. I wasn't above anyone. I was just someone who kept asking why. I lived simply. I wore old sweaters. My hair, as many noticed, never obeyed a comb. I walked in slippers even in public, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because comfort and clarity were more valuable to me than appearance. I found beauty in simplicity, not in luxury. I never understood the obsession with titles or fame. These things are temporary. What lasts, what truly matters, is how deeply you think and how kindly you live. When I wasn't lost in equations or thought experiments, I turned to music. The violin, especially, gave me something that no formula ever could. It allowed me to express emotions that words failed to capture. In music, I found harmony where the world often felt chaotic. I'd sit for hours, lost in a piece by Mozart or Bach, letting the notes carry me somewhere timeless. People often asked how I balanced science and art, and my answer was always the same. They are not separate. Music, like science, is about patterns, structure, beauty, and truth. Even at the height of recognition, when newspapers printed my words and crowds gathered to hear me speak, I never stopped asking questions. If anything, the more I learned, the more I realized how much I didn't know. That, perhaps, is the greatest paradox. The deeper you understand the universe, the more you see how endless it is, and with that realization comes humility. True knowledge doesn't make you proud, it makes you quiet. I remember once being introduced at a grand event with a long list of achievements read out loud. When it was my turn to speak, I simply said, "I'm still trying to understand things," and I meant it. The moment you believe you've figured it all out is the moment you stop learning. I never wanted to reach that place. There were people who expected me to be something more, a figure larger than life, always serious, always profound. But that wasn't who I was. I laughed often. I enjoyed silly jokes. I liked walking slowly, hands behind my back, daydreaming about the nature of reality. I admired children for the purity of their questions, for the way they approached everything with fresh wonder. In many ways, I think I spent my whole life trying not to lose that childlike curiosity. Humility isn't about pretending you're less than you are. It's about remembering that even the greatest minds are just small pieces of a much bigger picture. I never built my life to be remembered as a genius. I built it around questions, the kind that can't be answered in a lifetime. What is time? What is reality? Is the universe infinite, or does it fold back on itself? These are not questions with clear endings. They're doorways to deeper understanding. I've always believed that staying humble keeps you honest. It reminds you that your thoughts, no matter how brilliant they may seem, are always just a stepping stone for those who come next. And if I've contributed anything of value, it wasn't because I knew more, it was because I refused to stop wondering. Because at the heart of every discovery, every moment of insight, is not pride or fame, but a quiet, persistent question that refuses to be ignored. Thank you for walking with me through questions, wonder, and the quiet power of imagination. Even in a changing world, curiosity, kindness, and humility can still shape what's to come. So never stop asking why. It just might lead you somewhere extraordinary.